what is actually the root of legacy? What did it originally mean?
Hmm.
And I loved what I found, which was, quite a soon after it had its original meaning, it went on to now what it sort of means, like the inheritance of certain assets and, property, whatever. But the original meaning of it is an ambassador, an
Hmm.
envoy. And so in that moment, I thought, oh, yes,
Makes
that
sense.
is what we are doing. We are ambassadors. We are creating something that is an
Hmm.
ambassador, an envoy to the future. And I can get on board for that mission to be an ambassador for the future. And that's what story combined with media can do. So it's like, get on the spaceship. We're going, folks,
Hmm.
It's
Hmm.
it's an exciting, exciting thing to do and to realize that we have that power, as the people working with a family, but the family themselves,
Hmm.
they have that power if they so choose.
Welcome to Talking Billions. We talk about big ideas, big inspirations, big topics. We take on the hardest topic of all, money. How to make it, save it, keep it. But our conversations lead us to an even bigger question, what it means to live a rich life beyond money. My guests share their practices, principles, and evergreen wisdom. I'm your host, Bogumil Baranowski, author, TEDx speaker, and investment advisor to wealth creators with patient capital and an infinite investment horizon. I work with families and individuals who aspire to grow wealth over a lifetime and generations through disciplined, thoughtful investments in durable quality businesses while giving money meaning. Join me on this quest to unearth and share the wisdom of the ages. Let me share with you the podcast program disclosure statement. Blue Infinitas Capital LLC is a registered investment advisor, and the opinions expressed by the firm's employees and podcast guests on this show are their own and do not reflect the opinions of Blue Infinitas Capital. All the statements and opinions expressed are based upon information considered reliable, although it should not be relied upon as such. Any statements or opinions are subject to change without notice. The information presented is for educational purposes only and does not intend to make an offer or solicitation for the sale or purchase of any specific securities, investments, or investment strategies. Investments involve risk and, unless otherwise stated, are not guaranteed. The information expressed does not take into account your specific situation or objectives and is not intended as recommendations appropriate for any individual. Listeners are encouraged to seek advice from a qualified tax, legal, or investment advisor to determine whether any information presented may be suitable for their specific situation. Past performance is not indicative of future performance. None of what you're about to hear is investment advice. My guest today is Jamie Yuenger, founder and CEO of StoryKeep, a company dedicated to helping families preserve their legacies through powerful storytelling and documentary media. Jamie's unique approach to capturing family histories has transformed the way affluent families connect with their past, their values, and each other. Jamie, how are you? So nice to see you.
I'm well. Thanks for having me on. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
I'm so excited, and we had a fun conversation a few weeks ago. I
We
wish we
did.
were recording, by the way, but
Yeah, of course,
we're
always.
we're back here, and I want to ask some of the same questions. I know so much more, but I'm curious to learn even more. I want to start with the early days. I know you have stories. I want to
Hmm.
ask about childhood upbringing and how you think that time shaped you, your career path, your interests.
Yeah, I think, there's sort of two things that stand out that I can see now with hindsight of who I would become and what would become my driving passion. Um, One was I always loved to talk to strangers, and I always was the kid who kind of like talked to the adults. And when I was 7, my family moved from Colorado to Louisiana, which was a
Hmm.
very big cultural move to go from Colorado to the South. And my gym teacher, my physical education teacher, told my mom that you don't need to worry about Jamie because she'll never meet a stranger. And I think that is pretty true. And I think that has been kind of a part of how I've always been. And I've always been interested in people, which later, I ended up studying folklore, which is a study of traditional cultures. Always interested in human expression and individual stories. But I think the biggest thing that happened in my childhood, and frankly, I'm still kind of unraveling, as we are all sort of unraveling what
Our
happened
stories,
that
yeah.
made me who I am. When I was 9, my mother told me that I had been born, that I had a different dad. The dad who had been raising me, who I knew as my dad, was not my biological dad. And at the same time that she revealed this to me, she let me know that I could not tell my brother or my dad, the guy who had been raising me. So I was sort of locked in this secrecy with my mother about this affair that she had had. And that, yes, my dad, who was raising me, knew about this, but they had made a pact with each other to never tell me. I don't know what changed, but suddenly I had this information. And so I was always that was it's a huge thing to hear
Hmm.
that, and your relationship with your parents and what that whole context means to your identity suddenly shifted in a moment. And I think I've been on a journey and still am of, so okay, so who am I? What is the identity here, and how is it related to my family? And when I was 18, I met my biological father's mom, so my real paternal grandmother. And she brought me down into her basement in Wisconsin, in rural Wisconsin,
Hmm.
and showed me these artifacts that her ancestors, i.e., my ancestors, had
Hmm.
brought from Scandinavia when they immigrated to the United States. And it was really a mind blowing experience for me, because it's one thing to say, this is your father. It's another thing to say, this is your grandmother. But it's
Hmm.
a whole other thing to say, and by the way, just as a reminder, there was a whole line of other people before that. And so this insistence on what is family,
Hmm.
what is connection, what are the stories that are ours, that we take on, that we transform, that we edit,
Hmm.
um, that help us have a sense of self and rootedness in the current moment, and you know going backwards in our own family history.
When we spoke last time, you talked about secrecy and the truth. We're talking about family, and
Yes.
families have some secrets,
Hmm.
and you're there helping them find the truth, and the truth is not always easy. Can you talk about that beautiful dance between
Mm.
secrecy and truth seeking?
Yeah. Well, I will say on the outset that we're never sort of seeking to uncover secrets. Um, but I think the bigger question at play is emotional truth.
Hmm.
And also, there's stories that maybe we kind of heard, but we didn't really hear the whole story. Or there are things that our family, we know that there's stories there, but we don't really talk about them for any variety of reasons. And I think we are there as a outside compassionate third party to guide an individual or a family to assess the value of the truth. And like I said, there's many like variants on that. But I'll give you an example. There was a family we worked with. We were working with the family's third generation, set of cousins who were going to come into co-ownership. They were basically coming into the inheritance of this big family business. And the second and first generation had been interned in Japanese internment camps in the 40s. And this was not really a story that they talked about or they told, although to our eyes and our understanding as we were discovering and sort of developing a film project with them, realized, your resilience and your self-determination
Hmm.
and your idea and that it was important to stay together and to
Hmm.
also inhabit. and animate your family's Japanese American heritage is really, really tied to this. It's really, it's not everything, but it's a
Mm-hmm.
lot. And so even at, even in the early stages of the project, they were fairly hesitant to touch that. But as we talked more and more about it, they ultimately decided to include that story. So was it a secret? I'm not really sure if you could call it a secret, but it was something that they weren't going to bring into the light for the
Mm-hmm.
project. And it ultimately became a cornerstone of saying, this is really foundational to your resilience as a family, and you should embrace it.
Mm-hmm. No, I love that. And we'll come back to the idea that you shared with me of passing on values through stories.
Hmm.
I'm very intrigued by that. I want to ask you a big picture idea. How did you discover this pursuit, helping families preserve their stories, but especially affluent families in many cases? How did this particular interest find you?
Hmm. Well, I was doing sort of like quote unquote normal media work, I worked as a an intern and then later as a producer at WNYC, which is an NPR affiliate in New York City.
Mm-hmm.
And, I was being assigned stories. I was working in sort of a journalistic capacity. And I really didn't find that to my taste. I did not find that work environment to my liking. And at that exact moment, as the universe would have it, a dear friend of mine asked if she could hire me on the side to interview her father-in-law, this guy named Lou. And Lou had lived through the Great Depression. He had later started a successful business in China. And my friend wanted to make sure that his story, warts and all, her words,
Mm-hmm.
were preserved for her children, to know their grandfather, but also to better understand their father, her husband. And I didn't really think much of this at all. This job, this gig for my friend. But while I was doing it, this light bulb went off. Oh my goodness, this is my life's calling. This is my work because I
Mm-hmm.
just really saw, okay, here's professional media and here is the intimate life of a family. And there's
Right.
something really, really powerful about bringing those two things together. And to me, it was, you know, I had never heard of that concept. And, but I went with it. And
Mm-hmm.
without very much time passing, I started doing small kinds of projects for, people within my social network space, who knew that I was starting to do this. And I did that as sort of an answer to your second question. I did that for about 6 or 7 years for everyone, quote unquote, which is of course no kind of business model whatsoever. But I just I hadn't grasped yet.
Mm-hmm.
I think where the business is taking me, to be frank. So it was later that this woman in Connecticut, she had this unbelievable project that she hired us for. Actually, you can see examples of her project on our website. So her name's Phoebe. And she had hundreds of years of her family's history that had been passed down through the matriarchs of her family down to her. But she felt she was the keeper of the flame and she needed to tell these stories. And her project sort of kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And I thought, wow, this is a good client.
Mm-hmm.
And, but, I had never, because of my own upbringing, I had never met anyone who had that kind of disposable income to invest in something like this. And so I thought, I really need to understand this world of wealth, of family wealth better. And I, like, many of us, I just Googled to find more information. And I stumbled upon this book by Jim Grubman, now
Mm-hmm.
a respected colleague of mine, but at the time
Mm-hmm.
he was just this guy who wrote this book, Strangers in Paradise.
Mm-hmm.
I
Beautiful book.
got the book, read it front to back, made tons and tons of notes, and then I
Mm-hmm.
emailed the guy, and he was kind enough to reply. And he told me he was going to a conference the next week, and I bought a ticket and I went. to that conference to meet him, but also to sort of understand that world. And so I would say from about 2016, 2017, I became very self-educated, through conferences and speaking with colleagues about what is the relationship between narrative and emotional lineage and family culture and a multi-generational family with money, with wealth. Like, where do those overlap? So in the beginning, it was professional media and family stories, and then we sort of add in this third part of the wheel. And so it was started off that the families had, the families who were hiring me had the resources, the financial resources to do it. But as I went down that path further, I realized, no, it's way more than that. It's about a huge need and high stakes that we
Right.
want to have a continuity, an emotional and narrative infrastructure for continued connection across generations. And how do you, what contains an emotional or narrative infrastructure better than story? So that's the boat we're on. That's the vehicle that we're using. Not just for story's sake, for nostalgia or nice to have or keepsakes, but really as a tool for resilience and growth and clarity, individual clarity and also shared clarity around purpose. So I tell you this story in quite a short period of time, but it took a while to wrap my brain around it.
Yeah.
And I'm still learning, from the families we work with about the power and the meaning of what we do.
I'm hearing high stakes. I like the phrase strangers in paradise. And that book is a wonderful read. I think it teaches us empathy for people that are born into certain circumstances. It wasn't their choice, but they have to find their way, their bearings around it. And that's where our worlds overlap, and that's why I wanted to talk to you, because as you know, I manage money for families that have had wealth over multiple generations. And these are stock portfolios, but I know that, as I told you before, there's so much more than the portfolio and the money itself. And I do notice that it's the stories that might be the secret sauce that keep the family together and maybe even empower, enable the ability to preserve that wealth over a long period of time, especially when the original business is gone and it's just a collection of investments. I want to ask you about that connection between families' wealth and the stories they choose to preserve. What kind of an impact it can have on the success on that front?
Yeah, I think this is where the immense and nuanced intelligence of this work comes in. And it's interesting because, I think the industry is coming to realize more and more that these sort of soft, quote unquote, parts of what we're doing are, I don't know, we have to come up with a better word for that. Because
Human?
yeah, it comes down to, it's not a one for one. It's not put this in, get this out, right? And I think that's what we like. We like things that we can depend upon and know for sure. What I can tell you from my experience is that when families embark on doing some kind of narrative or story project in a film or a podcast with us, they often have at the outset an idea that, okay, there's a certain story that they want to tell and they have an end product in their mind. What's happening in the actuality that just is required of doing that kind of project is that they're going through a process together of identifying, unpacking, and articulating a story as a collective. Sometimes there's one person telling, his or her own life story, but often it's a family group. And when you create that space for people to do that, they start owning that story and owning those values more. And they also have to be together. Not always physically, but often that happens. So we had a family that they came together at a beautiful, vacation place, and they were doing filming there with us. And then they realized, because they were all there, that, okay, if we want to do things like this, not all of us can stay in this one place. It's not big enough for that. And these were 5 cousins who were going to co-own a huge, huge company.
Mm-hmm.
And so they together, those five people who are going to have to do many, many big, hard things together in decision making, they were figuring out, who are we? How do we present and articulate our own story? How are we actually deeply connected to one another?
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, we're all here together now. Like, how can we make this more pleasant? And they've since then made greater decisions of how they can come together physically more regularly in a more happy kind of, physical environment, all because of that project.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like I said, it's not for a one for one. Like every single story I would tell you of each individual family was have its own input and output. But there's no way that a family can go in and be asked kindly with guidance from us, what's your story? And come out of that experience without having a huge return on their emotional household as a family.
You said collective memory, and I really like that concept, and you and I talked about it. I talk with clients sometimes, and they tell me how the kids have no memory of the original business at times.
Mm-hmm.
Or other times they might not know how the money came about. And what the older generation knows and remembers, it's part of their DNA. The kids don't know it until you tell them. And I think it's so important to identify those stories that give context. When I sit down with a new client, every single time I ask, how did this money come about?
Mm-hmm.
Before we even start talking about investments and choices and expectations and returns, just tell me what that money means to you. And we'll come back to it throughout the conversation. But Jamie, I want to ask you about a big theme. Being an immigrant, I moved between countries, you moved between countries, and many of your clients have ancestors that immigrated to new countries. Can you tell me from your own perspective and your client's perspective, how does it feel to change countries, find a new home in a new place, and why it plays such a big role in so many stories that you get to share?
Hmm. Yeah. That is a very big question. I'll start by breaking it down a little bit about my own story. So
Yeah.
I'm American,
Mm-hmm.
and I, through no fault of my own, fell in love with the Dutchman. And it totally turned my life tipsy-topsy. And I moved from New York City
Mm-hmm.
to a very beautiful but very rural area of the Netherlands to be with the man of, my heart and dreams. And um, it it would be kind of impossible for me to describe, and I think so many people have experienced this the world
Mm-hmm.
over,
Mm-hmm.
how hard that transition is. No matter how much of a social butterfly you are, no matter how good at languages you are, it is a 100% turnover
Mm-hmm.
of your earlier reality. And to me, I think, and this is what I see in the stories of families who work with us, um, there is a point at which, at some point, and you'll never know when it is because it's different for everyone, but it must come in order for them to survive.
Mm-hmm.
They must surrender to this new world. And I had to, being the very stubborn person I am, it took me a while. But you do have to surrender and embrace this new world. And actually, the sooner that you do that, the
Mm-hmm.
more likely you are to be able to take the reins of your life and your destiny and your business, if you have that, and make use of what is there in the present moment, in the present country. And that's what I see that is so unbelievably inspiring to me over and over and over again in the stories that I hear. It was already inspiring to me before I moved from the States to the Netherlands. These incredible stories of people who had moved from other countries, or their grandparents or their great grandparents had, and what they had to give up and how they surmounted that. But now, having lived my own version of that story, um, it it's I mean it's just jaw dropping, and that's how I feel. I feel so privileged to be able to sit in on that, and not only sit in on that, but to be part of documenting that. because I think that, it's a version, of the hero's journey, to leave one land, to leave one known place, and to go to another. And I think that's why the immigrant story is so classic, because it's so stark, right? You leave the
Mm-hmm.
old land, and then you cross over, into the new land, and quite literally, for so many of the clients and the families that we work with, that's the case. So, um, I'm in awe. I think it is sometimes a really integral part of people's stories. And I talked to my husband about this, because there's sort of the American dream, and part of, um, the American experience is that nearly everyone, right, came from another place.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Not everyone, Native people, and not everyone of their own accord, not people who were enslaved, but all of those stories, people left another place. And, that's a huge part of our psyche, is that.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also the case for so many other people around the world, not the American dream version of, that immigrant
Mm-hmm.
story, but other, flipping back, my story coming from, I'm a American Dutch person, which is kind of, usually we hear Dutch American, but so I think that is, it's just a beautiful thing to rest a story on. But also, and I think this is where I want to push us a little further,
Mm-hmm.
it's not just the stories of those past, incredible people who founded something. It's also the story of now and how that's continued. We've worked with families who are 5, 6, 7 generations in. And yes, that original founder person who, despite all odds, had success. It takes incredible fortitude and creativity and ingenuity to keep that family going and staying
Mm-hmm.
together across
Mm-hmm.
generations. And it's not completely reliant upon that first person story. Usually
Mm-hmm.
that person was hard to handle. And big personality, and then what after that? And I think that is where we are also asking families, who else, what else happened?
Mm-hmm.
From my perspective, it's also, what were the women in this family doing, because often those stories are left out. What's happened to the second, third, and fourth generation of family members? What have they done? How have they continued this? How do they interpret their own life story and journey? Because yes, it's important to look at the founder, but we have to move beyond that, especially as this, industry is evolving. More and more time has passed since, not all founders, of course, because there's new founders all the time, but we really have to start looking at that. I feel that's an important part of my work.
I love the sound of that. I was in the room at some point during my career with a family that had the original seed of the capital created when Beethoven was writing his symphonies. And it started with an immigrant story, a Dutchman that moved to the UK, and that family ended up having a US connection over the next few generations. And obviously it's multiple families that came together over the last 200 years. But one thought that I had every time I had to speak with them, I was thinking, just giving respect to all the decisions that were made since that initial launch of this family fortune, that allowed them to be in the room today and have something to talk about in terms of financial capital. But there's so many other capitals they built throughout those generations. But it wasn't one person, as you said. It was many, many generations that made some wise choices on the way, that there's something today, despite of conflicts, wars, displacement, and everything else that happened in between, for us to look at and talk about and think about today. It's a very humbling, eye-opening experience to be an immigrant. And you and I talked about it. It's a new language, it's a new culture, and you have a completely different perspective. But you start almost from zero in a new place in many ways. That's very humbling. I want to ask you about the process. What's a typical StoryKeep project, if there is such? And what happens from the first meeting with a family to delivering the final film or podcast?
Well, like all good founders, I guess we learned, through the school of hard knocks,
Mm-hmm.
some of the essential ingredients to have a genuinely successful relationship and project with a family and a client. And one of the things that we learned over time is how important and crucial it is to have a discovery phase with a family, a discovery. We call it discovery and development. So we always start there, where we either speak with an individual, if there's just one person, or usually like a working group from a family. And so we have 3 or 4 meetings with that working group or that person, and we really dive very deeply and purposefully into what are you really looking to do here? Now, I know
Mm-hmm.
you're looking to make a film, but what is that film supposed to do? So for us, it's like, of course, you can just like grab something off a shelf, but it's not just like cereal for breakfast. It's like we're really
Mm-hmm.
making an investment of time and money and emotion here. And so we really try to get clear about what are really your goals right now?
Mm-hmm.
Are you a multi-generational family that's widely dispersed geographically and you're really excited for the future, but also afraid of like kind of falling out of connection with each other? Are you someone who just built a, incredible business, sold it, and trying to figure out how to tell that story to your children who kind of frankly don't know very much about how you did
Mm-hmm.
that? And maybe they don't care as much about, you know, the money that you made on that exit, but you still want to communicate something to them.
Mm-hmm.
So we're really drilling down into that. And then, of course, all the other things that we need to know in order to actually create a production. What archives do you have? Who are the speakers? Locations, places of importance. So that process generally takes 4 to 6 weeks, and we go, through in a very specific way that we've developed with family. And then we will say, okay, if you'd like to move forward, we can put together an actual project proposal based on all the alignment that we came to together, right? Nothing should be a surprise at this point. We've talked through it all with one another. So, okay, this is what we'd like to do. And that will be potentially the first out of many projects with the family over the trajectory of time with each other. But we'll start with that. And then if it's a film, we go into planning, put it to make it, easy to understand. Planning, scheduling, we have to get the whole film crew, together and organized on certain dates. And then the actual production, and production is, filming usually in a family or a person's home or place of, business or many other places. And, that can be 2 days of filming, that can be 15 days of filming. It really depends on what is needing to be done. And then we go into the editing process. Now, podcasting is somewhat similar, but there's a little bit more kind of in and out because that can be used more as an ongoing communication tool, right? So it can be recording, posting, just like, you're doing here, as opposed to a more involved film production that usually takes more time. And start to finish, that's somewhere between 6 and 12 months, like kind of on average 9, I would say. And then, of course, is the big reveal, when the film is finished, and we have a family that is screening their film in July, I believe, with 80 plus members of their family in a real movie theater, which is so fun. And then to me, that's when the real work begins.
Mm-hmm.
That's when the family is like, oh, it all comes together. I mean, I can't tell you how many times people have said, oh my gosh, we made a real film. Like, I don't know what they were thinking the whole rest of the time, but it
Mm-hmm.
really comes, together. And then it's like, what does this mean? It inspires conversations. It inspires next steps that have nothing to do with the film. And that's what I think, as far as when we talk about process of actually doing this, it's about always being really keen to what is really needing to happen here in this family, and that we're partners in that. And the tool we use is production and film and media, but it's not for just to make a pretty picture.
What's it like to be in the room after that movie airs, or even maybe at dinner with that family that evening when the conversations start?
Well, as you can imagine, it's so funny because everybody's just so human, right? Like everybody
Mm-hmm.
always thinks about what they looked like.
Oh.
And, um, I, the thing is that, of course, people are kind of blown away by
Mm-hmm.
seeing a whole compelling, comprehensive, all together in 25 minutes or whatever, it takes many different lengths and runtimes. But it's sort of like, whoa, I mean, just imagine yourself. Like if you
Hmm.
saw a version of your story
Hmm.
on screen
Right.
in beautiful living color with photos from your childhood and
Hmm.
voices of people who you love and who you respect, and having listening to people in your own family who that they have stories, or that they think a certain way or have a perspective, but frankly we hardly ever give each other the full time to tell those things. Because when we're at a dinner table, it's like da 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 da. That's just the tempo of normal human conversation. We sort of interrupt, in a sense, each other. Where this
Hmm.
gives each person who's been, interviewed all the time that is needed to share what they're going to say. So you're seeing people who you know so well
Hmm.
say things that maybe you've never heard them say before because they never were given that rare space to say it. And that's profound.
Hmm.
So that's actually why I think that often the first thing that people talk about is the easy thing to say, because it's like there's a lot going on under, the surface of, wow, what did I just experience and see? And then they'll say, oh my gosh, my hair or whatever, because we're not used to that. But then as the night goes on and the days and the weeks go on, it starts to really sink in. And that's when the conversations continue. And I've had the opportunity to speak with lots of families, 6 months, 1 year, 2 years. I engage with them in, a post project sort of interview about what's happened since. And that's where you can really hear all the layers of what the project meant and continues to mean in their lives.
It must be such a powerful and moving moment. I can't even imagine and what follows after. As I was listening to you, I was thinking of my mentor, Jay Hughes, who you might know,
Yeah.
and his work. And he has this idea of thinking who is at the table. And at times there might be multiple generations. And you can ask who they remember. So if you have a great grandparent at the table at Thanksgiving or other family
Hmm.
event, and you can ask them, who do you remember? And they
Hmm.
might remember sitting in the lap of their grandparents. And in my profession, we try to think about 100 years, and it feels like it's a lot. I
Hmm.
sometimes talk about the infinite investment horizon. But when you really think about that dinner, a holiday, you have 100+ years of family history,
Yeah.
living history with memories with you in the room. And Jay reminds me that you could just ask, who do you remember? And the youngest kid in the room running around, toddler, might be in a situation like this 100 years from now, 80 years from now, right? In another room, and somebody will ask that question, and you'll have 200 years of family history in
Hmm.
one room over one meal. I think it's a very powerful image, and it expands our imagination.
Hmm. Hmm.
I, I want to ask you about the most profound or surprising things that you've learned about wealthy families for your work.
Most profound or surprising. You know, um, I feel like it maybe needs a slight preamble to make sense of this. I grew up very, very working class. My mom
Mm-hmm.
was a waitress. My dad did landscaping. He had also been in the military before that. And I grew up with an imprint of their beliefs and their perspective on rich people.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't even know that I had carried that my whole life. But then when whoever's in charge of this whole incredible journey that we're all on together here on this planet decided to have families of wealth knocking on my doorstep to do these kinds of projects, I was
Mm-hmm.
deeply confronted with those
Mm-hmm.
imprints that my parents had put on me inadvertently.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to grapple mightily with that, to the point that I thought I can no longer do this anymore. I should
Mm-hmm.
really be doing something else. So going back to the hero's journey where Joseph Campbell talks about you're invited or told that this is your thing to do. And then what the hero does, when we're all heroes on our own journeys, right? What the hero does, AKA moi, was this is not for me. Give me another job. And I think on a really deep, it's almost hard for me to maybe express it, but on a very deep level, I had to digest and synthesize sort of the pains and the disappointments that my own parents had experienced, and that they had passed those on in kind of projecting them on to wealthy people, right? Their bosses or whatever. And I really had to kind of work with that and say, is this even mine? Or did I just inherit this, you know? And then I started looking at the actual people who I had worked with, the actual individuals, you know, name, first name, face in my mind. And every single one of those people were decent, kind, generous people. And so who was I actually talking about when I was talking about ultra high net worth people? At least from my worldview, I was just talking about this subset of people who I'd actually worked with. And that's the same thing as, I mean, I guess all prejudices that we all have. You know, if we actually looked at this person or that person that we have all kinds of notions about, it changes. And so, you know, when you learn of someone's story, you know, let's say we're reading headlines in the newspaper, and then we really learn about, okay, this person in Israel or Palestine, or this person in Ukraine, or this person in Russia. Like when we really know that person's story, it totally changes for us. And so I guess what I can say is it's specific and it's totally universal. What I've learned, right, about ultra high net worth people or families is that they are people who have a driving need, at least the people who come to us, to have greater connection, to do good, to make use of what has been given to them, that they're grappling with really big decisions and also disappointments and all kinds of things. And so I think the more I relaxed into who I really was and kind of let go of some of that inherited stuff, I was able to really sit with the plethora of those experiences. That's what I've learned about them. And it did surprise me because, you know, my parents had a big chip on their shoulder their whole lives. And so, surprise, surprise, there's a lot of terrible wealthy people and there's a lot of really wonderful wealthy people, just like everyone else. But it took me many years to come to that surprising conclusion.
I think it's beautifully put. And I was thinking of Lynn Twist and her writing. She got to meet Mother Teresa, and there's a story, and I'll share it as much as I remember it, but she got to see Mother Teresa work with the needy and people in really difficult circumstances. And there was a wealthy family that came in for a photo opportunity with Mother Teresa. And Lynn was in the room at the time, and she shares that story in a couple of talks and in her writing, how the family was not polite. And she herself, Lynn, was a bit offended by the way they behaved. When they left, she shared it with Mother Teresa, and Mother Teresa said, you have all this empathy for the poor, and you need empathy for the rich as well. And it's such a powerful image that we're all human, and we all need empathy, and we have to offer empathy to whoever you are, because we're all on different journeys. And it's very eye-opening when we think of the rich belonging to a whole different category, but at the end of the day, they're human, and they wake up with their concerns and worries. They fall asleep with their concerns and worries, just like all of us. And money here is just one dimension of the experience, but there's so much more to it. But that lesson in empathy from Mother Teresa from that book really spoke to me, and listening to you, I was thinking of it as we're all just human. Let's try to understand each other a bit better and see where everybody's coming from. What are some of the challenges that you're finding trying to document those legacies?
Hmm. Well, they run the gamut from logistical
Uh-huh.
to who owns the narrative, you know? So, by logistical, I mean to get an actual project underway. I think a big part of, and I don't want to understate it, a really big part of, I think, the value of what we bring is structure,
Mm-hmm.
deadlines, getting things done, and momentum.
Mm-hmm.
And, a lot of leading families, people who are members of those families, not everyone, but a lot of them have, very full schedules.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do you weave into that, right? So from that, but I would also say an interesting question that we are confronting more and more is who owns the narrative?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it's not a story, right? There's multiple speakers. There's people with different memories of things. There's different, a different emphasis on what is important. And how do we create a compelling story that isn't watered down
Mm-hmm.
by getting the average of everyone? How do we give different people voices? And what does that look like in a film that might run 24 minutes long? So I feel like that is a definitely a challenge, and it's one we're excited to take on more and more by finding different ways to hear from everyone in the family. So, for example, having a survey where there might be a smaller working group who's working with our team to create the film, but we craft a survey just for their family about, getting everyone to sort of contribute their thoughts and perspectives and who should be in the film, et cetera, so that we can really do a better job, you
Mm-hmm.
know, all the time. So it seems small, but if I was going to document your family story, who gets
Mm-hmm.
to say what it is, and what do we choose as the main storylines? And yeah, so there's a lot more, but I'll end there.
No, it's such a powerful idea who controls the narrative and how it's told so that all the family members get to share it.
Hmm.
I hear those stories even of siblings that are a few years apart, growing up in the same family, especially if
Yeah.
it's a family that acquired wealth throughout this lifetime. So,
Yes. Yes.
and the younger one has a very different perception of wealth and circumstances than the older one that might have been there when the family was in much more modest housing and
Hmm. Hmm.
only one of the parents was working and the other one was looking for opportunities, couldn't find. And the second one is born into parents running a business together and
Yeah.
benefiting from the first decade of the success of this new venture. And they think about risk and returns and rewards and downside and spending and saving in a completely different way. So I always find it fascinating that you don't have to look far at distant cousins. You could even look at two kids that grew up in the same house and have a very different story to tell. If you ask them what it was like to grow up in your house, it's a very different story.
Hmm.
I want to ask you about trust. And trust is very important in the work that I do, and I can see that it's very important in the work that you do. It's not something we receive overnight in one conversation. It's something that we earn over time. And in my case, sometimes it's a decade or two working with many family members. But you have to find a way to make people feel comfortable sharing deeply personal and sometimes even painful stories. How do you go about that?
Well, I think the very first thing that we do, because we have a team of creatives, film directors, interviewers, editors who work on the StoryKeep team across the world, the very first thing is being clear for ourselves about the environment and the experience that we want to offer families who
Mm-hmm.
are working with us, and then to share that very clearly to everyone who would like to work for StoryKeep and to see if there's a match there.
Mm-hmm.
Because I don't think everything can be trained or explained. I think we're trying to find alignment there from the very, very beginning. So I think you have to have the right people with the right mentality and their own personal purpose, their own life purpose of doing this kind of work, that they feel it's deeply meaningful and that they've also done a lot of it. They've been in situations that have been sensitive or difficult, or, and they have a rigor to their own training to be able
Mm-hmm.
to sit and hold space. That's one. Um, I think another thing is, we don't talk about this enough, but I do feel like the inner work that we did, myself and my husband, but I think it's the same in your kind of work as well, that you have to have gone through
Mm-hmm.
your own process and trials and tribulations and confronted your own stuff, for lack of a better
Mm-hmm.
word, so that you actually genuinely have an experience that you're referring to inside of your own
Mm-hmm.
emotional landscape, that you aren't being triggered, you aren't trying to rush things, you aren't trying to have your idea be heard. You're really able to just be with
Mm-hmm.
another person and hear their story. And so I think that in and of itself, that ability is a huge part of building trust. Because if I'm sitting with someone and I start to open up and tell some of my story, and then this other person who's supposed to be holding space for that and listening well and helping me think through it is then like doing all kinds of things other than listening,
Mm-hmm.
I don't trust them,
True.
right? I don't want to open up.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, building trust with someone looks a lot like nothing.
Mm-hmm.
It looks like sitting and not talking. And when you're early, I think, in the career work of documenting stories and interviewing, you think that you have to do a lot, you know, and you feel insecure when you're not doing a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And I think at least the kind of work that we do requires a different kind of listening and a different kind of guidance, which really is a lot of times just listening very, very well and speaking when is necessary. And so I think some of it is that. And of course, in our line of work, building trust also has to do with the fact that we have done well by the stories and the families of, you know, other families that say, oh, I've worked with this, company. I trust them. And that also builds trust. But you have to do that consistently
Mm-hmm.
over and over and over and over again. And, all families and all stories bring, their own unique challenges,
Mm-hmm.
so the ability to do that over and over and over again, it's always evolving us in our work to do it better and better. So yeah, that's what I think about trust is having really good people in place who know how to hold that space. And one thing that we're doing more and more now that's just happening with StoryKeep is a more formal onboarding process for everyone who works with us.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that is this is the client group that we work with. And you might have your own notions about what that means. Let us tell you what we think about that so that we're in alignment and that when you come on board, maybe you worked for Netflix, maybe you worked for an award-winning film at Sundance, maybe you made the last commercial for Nike. Wherever you're coming from, now you're here. And this
Right.
is what we're doing here. And so that is also a really important part of it is guiding people, so that by the time they're sitting in front of a client, they know exactly what they're there to do.
I have so many thoughts, but I have to cherry pick one or two. I'm thinking, as you said, before you create the space for others, it takes a lot of self-reflection where you're coming from. And I don't want to hijack this conversation, but I'll mention that I grew up in Cold War Poland in very modest circumstances, which I didn't know at the time were modest. I had nothing to compare it with. But I grew up in a shadow, I would say, of tales of family success before World War II. a certain even maybe level of affluence. And I wasn't told about it directly, but I got it through hints of family members speaking multiple languages or having a library of French books in the house, which was a sign of a certain level of affluence. And then World War II happened, and half a century of communism wiped it all out. So I always had a question: if we lost it, what could we do next if we ever have it again, not to lose it? That's why when I sit down with a family, I start with, for me, the big question: what can we do not to lose it? We can grow it, we can multiply it, but what are the decisions, the framework we have to think of not to lose it? Because once you lose it, building it from scratch, we talked about the immigrant story, it's very, very hard, one penny at a time. So when I sit down with a family that has had a family fortune for multiple generations, I'm always starting with, there's something that we can't afford to lose here. And let's think about the upside, not the upside first. And I'm very optimistic, but I'm also very cautious. And I think that comes from my upbringing and the stories that became part of my DNA, and that I look back now that my preparation for the work that I do did not start the day I graduated from university. It probably started when my grandpa or grandma took me on a first walk and told me a story that took me years to unpack and understand what is it that you're actually telling me.
Yeah.
I want to ask you about families changing and the vision for the future. I met families that are tied to one town. The business was started in this town. Everybody knows them in that town. I met families like that, and they're very local in that sense. But I'm meeting a lot of families that are more global. And they're dispersed around the world. The stories are even more diverse. How do you navigate that? Because I can imagine, I see it more and more, that families will have more of that element of being all over at the same time. And Zoom calls made it easy for all of us to talk at the same time on one occasion. But how do you see that storytelling and keeping that story together when we're no longer in one single town?
Well, I mean, what's interesting about that phenomenon that's happening is that it's happening at the same time that we now have very, very powerful media. And so, we all sort of have I think, a love-hate relationship with media and technology. But when you look at this story, right, where the family might have been able to all sit around one physical table or, meet together on a weekend for a big dinner or something like that, that's not necessarily happening anymore, either for geography or other reasons. And so media has this incredible power to tie families and members together, across many, many thousands of kilometers, and obviously through time, through generations. So it's sort of this incredible moment that I feel like really excited to be a part of, because I feel like what we're doing is utilizing this tool in this moment where people are becoming widely dispersed and their attention span is going down and down and down. So I'd love to fix that problem, generally speaking, but I'm not sure if we can go back on it now. But what we can do is use the power of story through kind of the gunshot of media, if you will, to disperse that. It's one of the reasons that we started developing private podcasts, was that instead of there being one film, which is, great to have, but to have something that is in an ongoing way connecting families, in a weekly or a monthly place, that the podcast being the place. So yeah, there's a really famous Dutch football coach, and I don't know his name, and my husband will be laughing at this when he listens to it, but he says there's always a disadvantage to an advantage. Like, he kind of flipped it on it, it's sort of a famous saying now in the Netherlands. So it's not always that, there's a disadvantage, the emphasis being like, you might think that one thing's great, but there's also a disadvantage to it. And it's important to look at that, right? So in this case, I mean, families are growing and building and going all across the world, but there's also the disadvantage of not being near each other. And so
Hmm.
how do we fix for that? And yeah, media is sort of an incredible tool for it, for that continuity and that connection.
As I'm listening to you, I'm thinking of the term that I discovered not long ago. It's called time binding. And I was introduced to it by an investor, Chris Mayer, who wrote a book about general semantics that I think you would enjoy. I'll send you more
Yeah.
details after we
Is
speak.
the book called Time Binding?
Uh,
Or that's
it's
the
a
just
Dear
a
Fellow Time Binder. It's the title, and then it's an introduction to general semantics, which is a whole school of thought. But the idea is that as a species, we can learn from people that are no longer here, and we can teach those that are not here yet through
yes.
the stories and through the work that you do. And it's a very powerful revelation that we might have, and that makes us stand out. I mean, humans stand out in many different ways, but the fact that we can preserve and learn something and teach someone. We talked about the people around the table, our virtual table these days, when people zoom in during Thanksgiving and want to be a part of something. But here we're going even beyond that, and people that are not even physically here on this planet yet,
Hmm.
or are no longer. And we can somehow transfer that knowledge, values, wisdom, legacy in a way that no other species can.
You know, you mentioned Jay Hughes earlier, and in his legacy,
Mm-hmm.
which he always likes to say in Latin, the
Mm-hmm.
word is this. He likes to go back in time. And I have to say, I did recently, as I was writing an article, I was like, what is actually the root of legacy? What did it originally mean?
Mm-hmm.
And I loved what I found, which was, quite soon after it had its original meaning, it went on to now what it sort of means, like the inheritance of certain assets and, property, whatever. But the original meaning of it is an ambassador, an
Mm-hmm.
envoy. And so in that moment, I thought, oh, yes,
Makes
that
sense.
is what we are doing. We are ambassadors. We are creating something that is an
Mm-hmm.
ambassador, an envoy to the future. And I can get on board for that mission to be an ambassador for the future. And that's what story combined with media can do. So it's like, get on the spaceship. We're going, folks.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's it's an exciting, exciting thing to do and to realize that we have that power, as the people working with a family, but the family themselves,
Mm-hmm.
they have that power if they so choose.
What a beautiful image. I'll be thinking about it for a while. Jamie, I have one last question. How do you think about success?
I'd be lying if I told you I didn't think about what success means,
Mm-hmm.
but I'd also be lying to say that I'm trying more and more these days to focus less on success
Mm-hmm.
and more on a good life. I think about this as we build the business
Mm-hmm.
and being the mother of a 5-year-old
Mm-hmm.
and the very happy partner of my husband, Pete. And I think, I'm not sure if I keep focusing and thinking about success, I'm going to end up happy or
Mm-hmm.
happier because if I'm doing what I'm doing in my line of work, I would be very unsuccessful if I then didn't have a connected, happy home life.
Mm-hmm.
So if I keep my sights on success, I might miss out on leading a good life. So I'm hoping it just comes and is a result of
Mm-hmm.
that intention of balance, not every day and in every way, but let's say on the whole, that I can be present. I can be present with a family who's coming to us, and I can be present with my daughter when she wants to play on the playground. And if I get a little too wrapped up in success, I might be checking my phone while she's trying to get my attention. So that's where my heart is these days.
maybe it's a bit like happiness. It sneaks up on us, and then we look back and we see, and we say, wow, this was actually really good work. It made a difference in somebody's life. Somebody found it helpful. And then we look back and think, I'm kind of proud of that. It made a difference.
Yeah, I think if you are a true servant leader in your lifetime, success will find you. And I think that's more and more what's leading me. Where can I actually be truly of service and create value and meaning for others and also in my own life? And then maybe success will just like come up and tap me on the shoulder.
I love the sound of that. Jamie, this was such a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate you sharing your work. And I think it will be an inspiration for so many families to think about for a moment about their stories and how they can tell them better and capture them so they don't get lost. And we can play a role as those envoys, ambassadors, time binders between generations. Thank you so much for today.
Oh, thank you. I really enjoyed it. Thanks so much.
You were listening to Talking Billions. We talk about big ideas, big inspirations, big topics. We take on the hardest subject of all, money. But our conversations lead us to an even bigger question: what it means to live a rich life beyond money. If you enjoyed the show, please take a moment and follow, subscribe, rate, and share with friends and family. We rely on word of mouth to promote the show. One click for you means the world to us. Thank you. Until next time, your host, Bogumil Baranowski.